So, a lot of producers can create a great sounding melody and chord progression, but struggle with where to go next from it. They find it difficult to link together ideas in order to create a full and exciting arrangement. The problem is, this leaves them with a lot of unfinished music and really barely any finished tracks that they can show. So, in this and the next few videos, we're going to tackle this problem head on, looking at 3 different arrangement workflows that will help you create more exciting and engaging arrangements. In these videos, I'm going to show you how to take a loop that you've created and how to develop that loop into a full track in a way that actually makes sense. Another way to put it is we're going to look at how to take an A section you've made and then create a B section that naturally follows it. Now, instead of dealing with this as a production problem, we're going to talk about this as an arrangement problem. The reason being is, if you can produce a full and interesting loop but don't know how to turn that loop into a full song, that's an arrangement problem, not a production problem. If you've got the production chops to create a great 8-bar loop, then you have the skills to be able to produce a full song. But if you don't know how to get out of that loop in a way that makes sense, you need to approach this as an arrangement problem. So, in this and the next few videos, we're going to view this common loop trap issue as an arrangement issue instead. Thankfully, doing so is pretty straightforward and requires really little to no theory knowledge. So if you don't know that much music theory, don't worry. It's not going to dive in too heavy into theory. It's going to be more about arrangement and songwriting. As a disclaimer, these concepts aren't going to be some mind-blowing techniques that'll offer a quick fix to every production problem you have. Rather, they're going to help you develop a better songwriting workflow, teaching you how to break out of the loop trap and how to finish more music. In other words, don't skip around these videos. Make sure that you're watching the videos in their entirety to get the most out of these concepts. So that's enough preamble. Let's dive into the first technique. Let's say that you have a really great loop, a great A section with a chord progression, a melody, and a production that you're stoked about, but you don't know where to go next. From a songwriting perspective, you only have 3 options of where to go to next with that B section. You can use the same exact harmonic structure, you can develop that harmonic structure, or you can introduce a brand new harmonic structure altogether. Now, don't worry if this confuses you. This is exactly what I'm going to break down in these videos. In this particular video, we're going to tackle the first arrangement technique, which I call the iterative approach. The iterative approach is when you take the core harmonic or melodic idea that's established in your A section and carry it over into your B section. Most often, you'll see this with a chord progression, where the same exact chord progression is played in both the A and B sections. Since both sections use the same chord progression, the transition between the two will be very smooth. Now, this may seem like a pretty obvious technique just to use the same progression in 2 sections, and it is a pretty obvious technique, but it's also extremely effective. It's a simple technique that a ton of successful producers use. The reason I'm telling you this is a lot of producers will get in their own head about creating this amazing and memorable B section that lives up to the A section they've made. They'll think that they need to come up with this brand new idea from scratch that blows the listener away when, in reality, their arrangement doesn't need to be that complicated. And that's what's so great about the iterative approach. You take an idea that already works, that main idea in your A section, and you build off of it, rather than starting back from scratch. So again, the iterative approach is when you take the core harmonic or melodic idea from your A section and play it again in the B section. Since there is an element of repetition, the flow between those 2 sections will be natural and familiar. While this technique will make your arrangement make sense, there needs to be an element of distinction that makes it interesting. If you just copy over those elements, the flow will be natural because there's nothing new, but if you don't change anything, it won't be exciting and the listener is going to get bored. Since you're simply copying over an idea, you need variation around that idea that makes that section feel new and exciting. If there is no distinction between your A and B sections, the listener will get bored because the track is simply too repetitive. Instead, you need to find a way to create purposeful distinction between those 2 sections. So before we dive into how to create this distinction between your A and B sections using the iterative approach, let's look at an example of this technique in action. So here I've got a remix that I'm working on for Kiara's track Messy. To showcase the 3 different arrangement workflows, I've created 3 different drops in this track, each of them using a different one of these workflows. I created the 3rd drop using the iterative approach that we've talked about so far in this video. So that's what I want to dive into next in this video, showing you how I was able to use this iterative approach to move out of this pre-chorus into a chorus in a way that was natural and familiar, but also exciting. Before we get going, let's just listen to this transition between the pre-chorus and chorus, and then we'll talk about what's going on in the arrangement. I'll jump you in just a little bit before this pre-chorus in the break.
If there's a lie, then I think that we crossed it. Second time you stayed the night. If there's a call, then I think that I lost it. And I should take my own advice. Let's stop before it gets messy.
So the production still needs a little bit of love, but you get the basic idea of what I'm going for. So let's dive into what's going on in this pre-chorus. So the foundation for this pre-chorus is built on this chord progression. I've got a few different layers, but let's look at the actual chords that I'm using. So here is my main chords group, soloed out. So let's talk about the actual chords that I'm using real quickly. This track is in the key of A major. First chord that I'm playing is a D major chord, which is the 4 chord in the key of A major. From there, I'm going to A major. So we're just going from D to A. From A, I'm going to F sharp minor 7. And then from F sharp minor 7, I'm going to E major, which is the 5 chord. So numerically, this progression is 4, 1, 6, 5. I don't want to dive too deep into this progression because I want to focus on the arrangement, but just wanted to give you an understanding of these chords that I'm using. As you can tell, I'm not playing them in their normal 1, 3, 5 form. For example, a D major triad is comprised of the notes D, F sharp, and A. But I've left the A out and added this E just to give it a bit more color and texture. And I've done this with a few of the chords if you dive into them. For example, if I bring this back up, we'll have the D major triad. But just to give it a bit of a different sound, you've got these notes kind of closely rubbing up against each other. I've brought in this E, which is just another note that's in this A major scale, and then removed the A on top just to close this voicing a bit. Not a big change, but I've done this with a few of the chords. For example, in this F sharp minor 7, I don't have the 5th, and in this E major chord, I did a similar thing to what I did in this D major chord. Like I said, don't want to dive too deep into this chord progression, but that is what's going on. It's a pretty standard chord progression. We've got 3 triads and this minor 7th. Progression is a 4, 1, 6, 5 progression, pretty common in pop music. So this chord progression lays the foundation for the pre-chorus. We've got a few different layers, like I mentioned. And then underneath, I've got a few different bass elements. And then halfway through, this sub-bass comes in, as well as these pluck chords, which are just playing the exact same chords that I have in the verse. So this is my foundation, my harmonic foundation for this pre-chorus is this chord progression. There's a lot of different layers that are playing it, but they're all playing that exact same progression that I showed you here. So the idea behind the iterative approach is you take that main idea, whether it's your main chord progression or your main bass line, and then you play that exactly in the chorus. There are 2 primary ways you can do this. 1, you can use the exact same instrument, or 2, you can play it with a different instrument. Here in this track, I've done a combination of both. You'll see this main group that I have in the pre-chorus. is also present in the chorus. These elements here get duplicated over in the chorus, and then I just add a little bit of sidechain to make it fit in context, but otherwise I've got the exact same elements playing. So because I'm using this chord progression in both sections, the transition feels natural and familiar. We have that element of repetition, which is extremely important to create a cohesive and exciting arrangement. But as I mentioned earlier, you can't just copy over your main idea and call it a day. You need to create variation around that to make that new section distinct. If it's too repetitive, the listener is going to get bored. You've got to create variation and distinction so that the listener stays engaged. At the end of this video, we'll look at more general examples of where this distinction can come from, but for now, let's talk about the specific techniques that I used in this track. Let's listen to this transition one more time.
Let's stop before it gets
So even though I'm using the exact same chord progression and instruments in the pre-chorus and chorus, these two sections feel distinct. The iterative approach isn't a lazy approach, it's an effective approach to create new sections that relate back to what your initial idea is, but also to add some variation that makes that exciting and pushes the track. The main thing that you want to think about is how is your focus different? The main focus of this pre-chorus is going to be the vocal, and the main focus of the chorus is going to be the vocal chops. So straight away, the main thing that the listener is supposed to be paying attention to has changed, which is going to create that element of variation and distinction. Here we've got vocal, here we've got the vocal chop. So that is the main way that I was able to create that distinction. Let's talk about some of the other ways. One of the most obvious ways is going to be the drums. Not going to act like you guys don't know how to program a drum loop, but I've got more of a laid back drum loop here in the verse or pre-chorus. And then in the final chorus, I've got a much bigger drop style drum loop. So a big element of what is adding the distinction between these two sections. Underneath that, I've done a few other things just to push the envelope for this chorus and add that further element of variation. One of the most obvious ones is going to be the bass. So we've got, where's my main bass group? So I've got my main bass group in here. We've got a few different layers. I'll just solo that out. Pretty simple and straightforward. It's just outlining the same exact root notes that the chords are playing, but it is adding that necessary element of drive that is needed by this chorus. So another way that I'm creating that variation by introducing a new melodic element. I've got another new melodic element that comes in this chorus, and that's going to be this piano. So let's take a listen to the main piano layer here. So this piano is playing off of the chord progression that you heard earlier. It is playing the exact same chords, but is playing it with a quarter note rhythmic pattern, which is just adding a bit more drive and energy to this chorus section. Let's play it without this group. We have those same elements from earlier, but it just doesn't have that drive. Adding this piano, which has a bit of distinction, it's not just playing the exact same chords, it has that variation and development, gives it that contrast between these two sections. There are a few other elements in this group. There is this high note, which just adds a bit more texture. Not a big element, but just enough to make this section feel new. I've got a layer on that high piano. And then I've got another chord layer that is playing the exact same chords that I have up top. Let's take a listen to that by itself. Essentially what this does is thicken up those chords that I have from earlier. The chords that I'm using in the pre-chorus are pretty low and muted. And because I want this chorus to feel distinct and have a bit more energy, I've got a slightly more exciting chord progression. So this is the group together without it. So again, I'm just using that exact same chord progression that laid the foundation for my pre-chorus verse loop that I really liked, and then playing it on a new instrument on top of everything else that I have here to create that distinction. So that is going to be it for this track example. Let's dive into Keynote real quick, where we're going to look at a few more examples of how to add distinction to your B sections using the iterative arrangement approach. Remember that the basis for the iterative approach is to use the main idea established in your A section, whatever that foundation was, typically the chord progression or bass line, and to play that idea again in your B section. This can be done either on the same instrument or with a new instrument. If it's done using the same instrument, you'll want to change the elements around that instrument in order to create distinction. That's something that I did in the track that I just showed you. Since I copied over those chord progressions exactly, I needed to create variation and distinction around that chord progression to provide that contrast to tell the listener that this is a new section. On the other side, moving that main idea to a new instrument is a great way to create variation that's exciting, since a new instrument has been presented, but also familiar, since the listener is already familiar with that chord progression. Outside of these, let's talk about a few other ways to be able to add distinction to your B section. So the first technique is to add layers on top of your main A section idea in order to create dynamic contrast. For example, let's say you've got a chord progression in your A section and you play it in the B section. You could use that same exact MIDI and add different layers on top of that idea in order to create some contrast. The most obvious one would be to add elements that make it fuller, but you could also do other things such as introducing a pluck layer that plays with the attack. In my track, I had more of a muted chord progression used in the verse, and then in the chorus, I added a much brighter and fuller chord progression that just gave that section some additional energy. The next technique is to add a new melody in your B section. This is something that I also did in the track that I just showed you. In the verse, the vocal was the main melody, and then I created a new melody in my chorus section using the vocal chop. So one of the most obvious ways to create that distinction so that the listener has something new to focus on. Next, you can use the same melody in your A and B sections, but change the instrumentation of that melody in the B section. Similar to how we've talked about doing this with a chord progression, you could use different instruments to play that main melody in the two sections. This will create distinction because a new instrument has been introduced, but also add a sense of familiarity and repetition because the melody at its core is the exact same. The next tip is one of the most obvious ones, and that's to bring in a new drum loop. You can build off of the loop that you had in the A section, or you can write a new one from scratch that contributes to the energy of whatever that section is. If it's a chorus or a drop, you can add a drum loop that helps to push that idea forward. If it's a bridge or a verse, you can create a different style of drum loop that helps to contribute to whatever the energy is you're trying to create. Next is to add more percussive elements. Outside of the chord drum loop, you can introduce more percussive elements that will create more distinction, add some rhythm and groove to your B section to add that contrast and variation. Next, you can add pads or different texture layers to give your B section a distinct sonic character. In my track example, I had a couple of those high synths that just added a bit of air and high to the track, giving it that distinction so when the listener jumps into the B section, it is immediately obvious to them that a change has occurred. If the mix is too similar between your verse and chorus, sometimes it'll be hard for the listener to tell exactly where they are. But adding some textural elements, adding some pads to your B section is a great way to create that distinction so that when the listener is in your B section, they know that a change has occurred. The next tip, another pretty self-explanatory one, is to either add or remove the bass line. This will depend on what's your A section or what your B section is going to be. In my track example, I had a bass in the verse that was more of a sustained sub bass, and then in the chorus, I had much more of an active bouncy bass. It'll depend on the style of music that you're working on, so I don't want to dive too deep into this, but another way that you're able to create that distinction is by either adding or removing the bass line or changing up the pattern. And lastly, you can also remove certain elements in order to create dynamic contrast. If you have your main idea from your A section holding over into your B section, you can also remove some of those elements from your A section in order to create dynamic contrast. A lot of the other techniques that we've talked about incorporate making your B section a bit fuller, bigger, and a bit more lively, but you can also go the other way by removing certain elements, going from more of a loud mix to a quiet mix in order to create that contrast. Contrast doesn't mean just moving from quiet to big, it can also mean moving from big to quiet. So that is going to wrap things up for this video. Hopefully you were able to gain some insight into the iterative approach to arrangement. In the next video, we'll be talking about the second technique, which is going to be the development approach. The development approach is the most popular of the three and my personal favorite, so you'll definitely want to check that out. If you have any questions, please drop them below in the comments. Otherwise, I will see you all in the next one.